talk a little bit about what the increase in superstorms as a result of climate change and the impact of that, and also touch on perhaps the even scarier prospect, which is wars being fought over water.
Well, these are both things that we know to worry about based on, warming trends already. We're seeing more intense storms, not just of hurricanes, but the derechos that we've been seeing lately over the Midwest. These sort of rain bombs and in across the country, across the world. The example that I'd like to talk about most, which is most powerful to me, is about the fact that the city of Houston has been hit by 500-year storms in 5 years. That's a term that obviously doesn't mean what it used to, but it's useful to remind us like how different a world we're already living in today. So, 500 years ago, there were no European settlements in North America at all. So we're talking about a storm that we would expect to hit once during that entire time. The arriving of Europeans in North America, the forging of colonies, the fighting of a genocide against the native people, the fighting of a revolution, the waging of a slave empire, the Civil War, industrialization, World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War, the age of the American Empire, the end of the Cold War, September 11th, the financial crisis, COVID-19. Like, we're talking about one storm in all that time. And Houston's been hit by 5 of them in 5 years. So they're literally dealing with millennia of extreme weather compressed into half a decade. I think it's also important to keep in mind, like, Houston's still standing. That weather is unprecedented. It's going to require an unprecedented response. They're now talking about building this thing called the Ike Dike, which is basically a seawall around the city. These kinds of interventions are going to be incredibly expensive and disruptive. They're probably going to not protect some communities. And while they do protect other communities, there are huge problems with them ecologically as well. But it does not mean that 30 years from now, 40 years from now, all of these cities will have to be abandoned. It just means that we will be dealing with a much, much higher level of disruption in our daily lives than we're comfortable dealing with today. And that extreme weather of that kind will become much, much, much more common. So I talked a few times over the course of this interview about the incredible heat wave in South Asia that's been going on. Literally, it's been going on for 3 straight months.
Wow.
Affecting more than 1 billion people. And this would have seemed like an unthinkable event as recently as 5 or 10 years ago. But a scientist who's really at the forefront of studying these frequencies, her name is Freddie Otto, I spoke to a few weeks ago about it, and she was saying this is probably like a once a decade event or something like that now. The same is true of the Pacific heat dome. That would have been, before industrialization, she told me, a 1 in 8 million year event, which means you'd have to run the entire history of humanity over 30 plus times to encounter it once.
Oh my God.
And we saw it last year.
Wow.
So, we're moving into this world in which our daily lives are going to be defined by weather events that we used to consider extreme and are going to be forced to consider normal and adapt to as though they are normal. And wildfires are another really powerful example of that. What that means for, social stability and warfare is, I think, kind of intuitive. When countries are prosperous and have high levels of social trust, they can accommodate much more serious disturbances and disruptions than countries that are poor with badly managed bureaucracies and public services and with low levels of social and public trust. And what climate change will do is put pressures on all of us, everywhere in the world. But those pressures are going to be most acute in the places that have the least resources to deal with them. And the end result is likely to be considerably more conflict. And those who study that are, quick to point out it's not just state conflict. There's actually a relationship also with temperature and interpersonal violence. So when things are hotter, you see more rapes and murders and domestic assaults, burglaries. And it's also the case that more people are admitted to mental hospitals on those days. So, you're seeing just a massive, massive disruption to what we have taken as the settled fundamental basis of modern life. And the whole board game there is just being shaken by climate change. in terms of water in particular, I don't know exactly how to project that future, but the projections for sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia and their water issues are really dire. We are already living in a world where, I don't know the number off the top of my head, I think it's something like 800 million to 1.2 billion, somewhere in there, do not have access to clean drinking water. But there have been parts of India already where they've had to, literally like the taps ran dry in cities, at least for a period of a few days, because of ongoing drought. And we're seeing much worse drought than that, even in the Horn of Africa, where in Kenya, I think they've had 4 straight rainy seasons basically fail. And so the entire agricultural, system of that region has failed as a result. It's one reason why I just wrote a big piece this week. One reason why we're seeing this incredible rise in global hunger. We've heard a fair amount about the impact of the war in Ukraine on that, because Russia and Ukraine supply something like 12% of globally traded calories, it said. But the truth is that when the current head of the World Food Program came in 2017, he estimated, and this is a former Republican governor of South Carolina, David Beasley, who I spoke to, he estimated when he came in 2017, there were 80 million people in the world who were suffering from acute food insecurity. And the number had climbed to 275 million before the Ukraine war. And now it's 325 million. He actually expects it's going to grow in the coming months, which means even if the effect of the Ukraine war is to push 50 million people into acute food insecurity, the effect of the last 5 years, in part having to do with climate and other impacts, conflict too, we've quadrupled the number of people who are in acute food insecurity. And for the same piece, I spoke to a woman named Sarah Menker, who's an Ethiopian-born entrepreneur, runs a company called Grow Intelligence, which does a lot of incredibly sophisticated satellite monitoring of agriculture, especially in the developing world, but really everywhere. She gave a big presentation before the UN Security Council about the worsening hunger crisis. And she said that 2 things. Just in the 6 months since December, which is mostly the effect of the war, 10 million people have been pushed to the edge of famine just in the last 6 months, and 400 million people have been pushed into the category of food insecure.
Wow.
And what's really astonishing about that is that it is more than the number of people that were pulled out of that category through China's incredible poverty reduction efforts over the last 2 decades. So we hear a lot about how the world is much less poor than it used to be. There's much less extreme poverty. That's largely because of the development of China and the growth of the Chinese middle class. And we've undone those gains of 20 years, we've undone in just 5 or 6 months because of the incredible food price crisis that we're living through now. And most people who study this will tell you, we're not living in a Malthusian world. We have enough calories to feed the world. The agricultural yields are, on the whole, globally growing. We shouldn't worry in a global sense about having enough food. But our systems are so fragile that when there's disruptions here and there, it means that we have to redesign our entire food distribution network basically every year because of climate impacts. And that is an incredibly costly undertaking, which is basically too expensive for the world's poor to afford. And we know that in the next few decades, those climate impacts are going to grow more intense, which means the disruptions are going to become more regular, and the food price spikes are going to become a much more common feature of our global food system, which is going to ultimately, unless we take really dramatic action, produce much, much more hunger. So we've gotten used to the idea, or some of us have, that globally hunger is declining, poverty is declining, but we can't just say, that's it, that's enough. We know that because of the disruptions of climate change, the challenges are going to grow much bigger, and it's going to make the goal of feeding all the world's people even harder, even though we have more food to do it with.
Wow. That is truly extraordinary and disturbing to contemplate. And I think it's really important for people to take in what you said there, that while, yes, the war in Ukraine has caused these spikes in prices, have pushed millions into poverty and food insecurity, that this is actually part of a broader trend.